Unsung heroes of World War II, the Black Angels of Bataan. When most people think of World War II, they picture tanks rolling through Europe, stormed beaches in Normandy, or the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. But far from the headlines and the medals, there were heroes nobody talks about, men and women whose bravery didn't make the newspapers, but whose actions saved thousands. And among the most forgotten of all were the Black Angels of Bataan. In the spring of 1942, as Japanese forces overwhelmed the Philippine Islands, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were trapped on the Bataan Peninsula. They were outgunned, outnumbered, starving, and sick. Supplies ran dry, ammunition ran out. And as General MacArthur evacuated, a haunting order was issued. Every able-bodied nurse, every American woman, get out. But not all of them left. A group of African-American Army nurses, known later as the Black Angels, refused to abandon the men who needed them. Despite the segregation policies of the U.S. Army, despite the danger, and despite being told their presence was neither needed nor wanted, they stayed. Lieutenant Florence Small was one of them. She had joined the Army Nurse Corps to serve her country, but instead found herself on the front line of a forgotten siege. Working out of jungle hospitals with no electricity, no clean water, and barely any medicine, she treated soldiers suffering from dysentery, malaria, and bullet wounds. She performed emergency surgeries with bare hands. She amputated legs using kitchen knives sterilized over fire. And every night she went to bed wondering if the Japanese would bomb the hospital next. But Florence was not alone. There were nearly 80 black nurses deployed across Pacific bases, some in Bataan, others in New Guinea and beyond. They were barred from white hospitals. They had to sleep in segregated tents. They weren't even allowed in officers' clubs. But none of that mattered when the bombs started falling. Color didn't matter when a soldier was bleeding out on a cot. These women worked shoulder to shoulder with anyone who needed help, and often they did it without backup. When Bataan fell and the infamous Death March began, most U.S. forces were captured or killed. But a few nurses managed to slip through the chaos, hiding in the jungles, crossing rivers, evading enemy patrols, carrying wounded soldiers on makeshift stretchers made from banana leaves and sticks. Lieutenant Harriet Elam, barely 5 feet tall, once carried a grown man on her back across 4 miles of rough jungle to reach an Allied base. She had been a school teacher before the war. She had never fired a gun. But in Bataan, she became a soldier without a weapon. None of them were given medals at the time. When the war ended, the newspapers celebrated generals and politicians. The Black Angels quietly returned home. No parade, no press. Some struggled to find jobs because of the color of their skin. Some were denied promotions. Others never spoke of what they did because nobody wanted to listen. But their legacy lived on in every life they saved. And decades later, historians finally began to uncover their story. Not from military records, they were mostly erased, but from letters, diaries, hushed stories told at church picnics and nursing reunions. These women changed medicine. They changed the perception of what a nurse could do. They proved that courage doesn't need rank, and they did it while their own country still treated them like second-class citizens. So when we talk about World War II, remember this: victory wasn't built on just strategy or firepower. It was built on back-breaking work done in muddy tents, on decisions made in the middle of the night with no clear orders, on compassion stronger than fear. The Black Angels of Bataan didn't just fight a war overseas. They fought a war at home, too, against racism, against invisibility, against a system that tried to write them out of history. But they are still here, in the footnotes, in the memories of men who wouldn't have lived without them, in every nurse who dared to stay when it would have been easier to leave. And now, it's time the world remembers them by name. Imagine this. You're a U.S. Marine stationed on the blood-soaked beaches of Iwo Jima. Japanese snipers are hidden in every ridge. Mortar fire is raining down. You grab your radio and call for reinforcements. But instead of barking out orders in English, the man beside you starts speaking a strange language. Clipped, fast, rhythmic. You don't understand a word. But the man on the other end does. And within minutes, artillery is landing exactly where it needs to. The enemy is stunned. Reinforcements arrive. Lives are saved. That voice, the one speaking in a code no enemy ever cracked, belongs to a Navajo code talker. During World War II, America had a massive problem. Every military order sent over the radio was at risk. Japanese cryptographers were skilled, fast, and relentless. Allied codes kept getting broken. Lives kept getting lost. The military needed a language no enemy could understand, no machine could translate, no spy could mimic. And the answer came from a place the generals never expected, deep in the canyons of the American Southwest. The Navajo language is one of the most complex spoken languages in the world. At the time, it had no formal alphabet, and fewer than 30 non-Navajo people could speak it fluently. It was passed down orally, rich in metaphor and rhythm, nearly impossible to master without being raised in it. And for the U.S. Marines, it became the perfect shield. In 1942, a man named Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran and son of missionaries who had grown up on Navajo land, pitched an idea to the Marine Corps. Use Navajo speakers as battlefield communicators. The idea sounded crazy at first, but the first test was a success. Messages that took hours to encrypt and decode by machine could be spoken and understood in under a minute. That same year, 29 Navajo men were recruited and sworn to absolute secrecy. They weren't told where they were going. Their families were kept in the dark. Some were only teenagers. But what they were about to create would change the course of the war. These 29 men developed the first Navajo code. They didn't just speak the language. They built an entire military vocabulary from scratch. Since there were no Navajo words for tank or grenade or battleship, they improvised. A tank became turtle. A fighter plane became hummingbird. A battleship? Whale. They created hundreds of words and then trained each other until they could fire off entire battle reports faster than any Morse code operator alive. They were sent to the Pacific, where their work became crucial during the bloodiest campaigns: Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. During the invasion of Iwo Jima alone, 6 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock, transmitting more than 800 messages without a single error. A Marine signal officer later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." But even as they saved lives and helped win battles, they were not celebrated. They were ordered to keep everything secret. For decades after the war, they couldn't even tell their wives or children what they had done. While generals received medals and parades, the code talkers returned to a country that still discriminated against them. Some couldn't even vote. Others came back to poverty on reservations forgotten by the very government they had served. Still, they carried the weight with pride and silence. It wasn't until 1968, 23 years after the war ended, that the Navajo code talkers were finally declassified. And even then, the recognition was slow. No major textbooks mentioned them. No statues were built. Their story floated in the shadows, passed down in veterans' whispers and tribal gatherings. But things began to change. In 2001, President George W. Bush awarded the original 29 code talkers the Congressional Gold Medal. A museum was planned. Tributes began to grow. And finally, the silence broke. They were no longer just voices behind radios. They became voices of history. And what makes their story even more profound is this: the same U.S. government that had once tried to erase the Navajo language, banning it from schools, punishing children for speaking it, now owed its victory to that very language. This is the irony. The same words once suppressed were now weapons. Culture became code. Identity became strength. The Navajo code talkers weren't just translators. They were warriors, strategists, innovators. They didn't just win battles, they preserved a culture by proving its value in a world that had tried to destroy it. They remind us that the most powerful weapons in war aren't always guns or bombs. Sometimes they're stories, languages, traditions, voices once silenced becoming impossible to ignore. The women spies of Nazi-occupied France. Paris was beautiful in the 1940s. The streets still smelled of roasted chestnuts. The cafes still played soft jazz. But behind every cobblestone and under every warm baguette was the shadow of boots, German boots. When Nazi forces marched into France in 1940, they brought fear, surveillance, and total control. But what they didn't know was that their greatest threat wasn't an army. It was a woman with a bicycle. Across the French countryside, women became the unexpected backbone of the resistance. Not just as couriers, but as spies, saboteurs, assassins, and masterminds of chaos. Some were grandmothers. Some were teenage girls. Most were never trained for war. But when their country fell, they stood up. One of them was Odette Sansom, a British mother of 3 who volunteered to go behind enemy lines. She parachuted into France at night, carrying nothing but a fake ID and cyanide pill. She posed as a housewife, but she was actually coordinating weapons drops, gathering intelligence, and smuggling Allied soldiers out of German territory. When she was eventually captured and tortured, she told the Gestapo, "You'll get nothing from me." And they didn't, even as they pulled out her fingernails, even as they shipped her to the infamous Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived, and never once gave up a single name. But Odette wasn't alone. In Lyon, there was a woman named Lucie Aubrac. By day, she was a schoolteacher. By night, she was organizing jailbreaks, printing underground newspapers, and delivering coded messages hidden in birthday cakes. When her husband, a fellow resistance leader, was arrested, Lucie marched into a Gestapo office, lied to their faces, and demanded his release. They believed her. She walked him out the front door, and then went right back to fighting. Another name lost to time is André Borel, a young nurse who joined Britain's Special Operations Executive. She parachuted into France disguised as a social worker, but her real job was far more dangerous. She coordinated sabotage missions against German trains and communication lines. She was caught. She refused to talk. And she died in a Nazi concentration camp with her head held high. And then there were the nameless ones, the women who aren't in the history books, the farmer's wife who hid Jewish children in her wine cellar, the laundress who passed notes sewn into collars, the waitress who memorized the conversations of drunken SS officers and whispered them to Allied contacts. What made these women so powerful wasn't just their courage. It was their invisibility. The Nazis underestimated them. They assumed women were passive, apolitical, harmless. That assumption became their blind spot, and that blind spot became deadly. Women used everything at their disposal. Lipstick tubes became storage for microfilm. Bicycle tires were lined with explosives. A change in hairstyle meant a message had been received. A baby's cry could signal danger. A clothesline full of laundry wasn't just laundry. It was a code. White sheet, safe to land. No sheet, stay away. Entire resistance networks were run from flower shops and bakeries. And they weren't just passing messages. These women smuggled explosives, helped shoot down German supply trucks, organized factory strikes, fed and clothed Allied pilots in hiding. But their greatest weapon? Silence. Most of them were never caught. They vanished into the background as quickly as they emerged, and for decades, no one spoke of them, not because they were forgotten, but because they never wanted credit. They saw their actions not as heroism, but as duty. After the war, many returned to ordinary lives. Some went back to teaching. Some raised children. Others never told a soul what they had done. Their stories slipped through the cracks of grand military narratives, replaced by the names of generals and presidents. But they were the ones who risked it all without ever asking for a parade. And for those who didn't survive, who were caught, tortured, and executed, they became ghosts with purpose. Women like Violette Sabo, who faced a firing squad with a smile. Like Simone Seguin, who picked up a machine gun at 17 and fought Nazis in the streets. Like Madeleine Barclay, who disappeared on a covert mission and was never seen again. These weren't just spies. They were symbols. Proof that war isn't only fought on the battlefield. It's fought in whispers, in kitchens, in alleys, in decisions made in seconds, in courage without applause. They turned the idea of weakness on its head. They proved that being underestimated is a powerful weapon. That resistance can wear a skirt. That espionage doesn't always need a gun. Sometimes all it needs is a good lie and the will to keep going. And today, when we talk about the heroes of World War II, we must say their names, not as an afterthought, but as the main story. Because without them, many more would have died. And perhaps, just perhaps, the war would not have ended the same way. The Forgotten Railroad Men, Chinese-American spies who shaped the war. In the deserts of Utah and the streets of San Francisco, thousands of Chinese Americans lived quietly in the margins of American society. Many were sons and grandsons of railroad workers who had helped build the transcontinental train lines decades earlier. Men who were paid less, slept in tents, and were written out of every history book. By the time World War II broke out, they were still seen by many Americans as foreigners, second-class citizens in the land they helped build. But war has a strange way of flipping the rules. When the U.S. military began fighting across the Pacific, it found itself in desperate need of operatives who could speak multiple Chinese dialects, blend into Asian cities, and gather intelligence without attracting attention. That's when they turned to a group of men who had always been ignored. Chinese Americans with American loyalty, deep cultural roots, and the ability to go places no white soldier ever could. They weren't officially labeled spies. On paper, they were liaison officers, interpreters, civilian assistants. But make no mistake, they were agents. Some worked under the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. Others were attached to the Army Signal Corps or Navy Intelligence. They carried fake identities, forged papers, and were trained in codes, surveillance, and silent movement. One of them was Arthur Chin, born in Portland, Oregon. Before the war even reached American shores, he had flown to China and joined the Chinese Air Force to fight Japanese invaders. He became one of the first American aces of World War II, long before Pearl Harbor was bombed. But his story, like many others, vanished into obscurity. Another was Moon Fun Chin, who didn't drop bombs or fire guns. He flew supply planes over the treacherous Himalayas, routes nicknamed the Hump, delivering weapons, medicine, and fuel to Chinese resistance forces fighting the Japanese deep in the mountains. Every flight was a gamble. Turbulence, engine failure, enemy fire, and freezing temperatures were constant threats. But Moon flew hundreds of missions and lived to tell about it. And then there were the true shadows, men like Chu-Man Lee, who posed as a merchant in Japanese-occupied Hong Kong. In reality, he was reporting on troop movements, organizing sabotage missions, and relaying messages to American command. He operated alone, no backup, no extraction plan. If he was caught, he would have been tortured, executed, and erased. But he kept going, sending coded letters hidden in tea crates and delivering intelligence that helped Allied forces strike targets with shocking precision. Back in the U.S., things weren't easy for their families. Chinese Americans still faced racist laws, housing discrimination, and were often mistaken for enemy nationals. The irony? Their sons were behind enemy lines, risking their lives to defeat the very people who were bombing America's allies. The military rarely gave them recognition. Even among their fellow soldiers, They were often seen as outcasts. Many were barred from officer positions. Some were assigned to segregated units or sent on the most dangerous missions because they looked the part. But they accepted the risk, knowing they were fighting two wars, one against fascism abroad and one against invisibility at home. One remarkable mission took place in Burma, where a Chinese-American OSS agent helped train native resistance fighters in guerrilla warfare. Using a blend of Cantonese, Mandarin, and local dialects, he helped organize ambushes against Japanese convoys and even coordinated a high-risk mission to sabotage a major supply depot. He never received a medal. No one even knew his name. But the effect was undeniable. Every destroyed bridge, every intercepted message, every safe house protected by a nameless Chinese-American agent helped tilt the war ever so slightly toward victory. After the war, many of these men simply disappeared back into civilian life. They worked in laundries, opened restaurants, drove taxis. They didn't talk about what they had done, not because they were ashamed, but because no one ever asked. It would take decades for their role to be recognized. Some finally received posthumous awards. A few were honored in veterans' halls, but most never even made the footnotes. In the official story of World War II, they were ghosts. In reality, they were guardians. What makes their sacrifice even more staggering is that many served during a time when Chinese Americans were not even allowed to become U.S. citizens under the Chinese Exclusion Act. They fought for a country that still had laws against them, and yet they fought anyway. Their story forces us to confront a deeper truth. Patriotism isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear stripes. Sometimes it speaks quietly, in dialects the enemy doesn't understand. It crosses mountains, it lives in shadows, and it dies without applause. The forgotten railroad men of World War II didn't ask for statues. They only wanted to be remembered. The final salute, when history forgot but courage remembered. You won't find their names in most history books. Their photos aren't in the museums. They didn't make the front pages. They didn't give speeches. They didn't lead armies. But without them, World War II might have ended very differently. The Black Angels of Bataan didn't carry guns. They carried wounded soldiers across battlefields, stitched torn bodies under open skies, and risked their lives to keep others alive, all while their own government segregated their tents. They fought with bandages, with hands, and with a quiet defiance that said, "We belong here, too." The Navajo code talkers never fired missiles. They spoke them. Their ancient language, once ridiculed and banned, became the most unbreakable code of the entire war. Their voices echoed through radios on the bloodiest islands of the Pacific, and no enemy ever understood a word. Their silence was sacred. Their code, a cultural rebellion wrapped in loyalty. The women of Nazi-occupied France didn't wear uniforms. They wore aprons. They baked cakes with hidden maps. They raised children while smuggling messages in hairpins. They lied to Gestapo officers with calm smiles and risked torture every day for the sake of freedom. They were underestimated, and that made them invincible. The Chinese-American agents didn't march in parades. They infiltrated enemy cities, flew death-defying missions, and carried the burden of two battles, one overseas, one at home. They proved that the color of your skin does not determine the size of your sacrifice. And they did it while being treated as strangers in the country they served. These are the unsung heroes of World War II. They didn't ask to be heroes. Most never even used the word. They weren't chasing medals or legacy. They were ordinary people placed in impossible situations. And they made the impossible happen, again and again. Some never came home, some did, and lived in silence for decades, watching their stories get buried beneath headlines about generals and treaties and atomic bombs. But you know what's stronger than being forgotten? Being remembered now. Because here's the truth. History is not just what we're taught in school. It's not just the names etched on marble. It's also the heartbeat behind the headlines. The nurse who stayed when others fled. The boy who turned his native tongue into a battlefield weapon. The mother who hid resistance notes in baby clothes. The pilot who flew without a flag. They didn't wear capes. They wore duty. And that's why we tell these stories now. Not just to honor the dead, but to awaken the living. To remind ourselves that heroism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the jungle. It taps through radios. It weeps in bunkers. It waits in silence until someone finally says, "I see you." And now, we do. If one day someone ever tells you history is just dates and battles and big men making big moves, tell them no. Tell them it's also about women on bicycles, about coded lullabies, about underdogs who never stopped running toward the fire. Tell them it's about voices that were once ignored until they became echoes in our bones. These unsung heroes may not have asked for a salute, but they damn well deserve one. So raise your voice now in their honor. Like, comment, share, subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for remembrance. Because if we don't tell their stories, who will? This is Uncle Luke Tells, and we remember what the world forgot.